Good evening. I was just writing an introduction to Scott Cohen's lecture in the last few minutes, and it occurred to me that there are two terms here I just didn't want to use without making sure the definition or the intention was clear. So when you hear the term introvert in this context, it refers to subject matter which is, in an artistic sense, in a psychotherapeutic sense, internally derived, and extrovert in this context refers to a behavior pattern whose obligations are first to the world outside itself. This is less an introduction than a preface to Scott Cohen's lecture. Recently, I was in Italy to deliver a lecture to Rome's Society of Architects. I was invited to visit Nero's Domus Aurea, now buried in the hill overlooking the Colosseum. What fascinated me there was less what Nero had done, more the intersection between Nero and his on-site successor, Trajan, whose structure was violently deposited around and through the Domus Aurea below. I raise this anecdotal piece of history as both a good and bad conceptual example of Scott's current subject matter, as I understand it, expressed so articulately in drawing over the past several years. The Trajan-Nero case was not simply the cultural intersection of alternative spatial demands. Rather, it was, for Trajan at least, a personally assertive political act. One can speculate abstractly on the now distilled spatial consequences, but it is important to understand that Trajan's intention was not intellectually speculative or private. It was of the world, pragmatic, and extroverted. This was an intersection whose objective was to emasculate the form of its predecessor. I'm raising here the issue of motive, of personal exegesis versus more public ends. The question for Scott is whether what he presents here is an introverted system, a private cerebral logic which exists either to discover ways of making space or, equally plausible, to confirm an a priori conception. Does Scott know where he will end when the process begins? Or is the drawn result a perpetually evolving speculation? Is this, in other words, Wittgenstein's discussion, an inquiry that arrays spatial formulae against itself, searching for an internal validation? Is the drawing the object of its own predefined subject? Can this be a search that admits other participants? Last week, we listened to Guy Nordenson analyze Steve Hole's Verrandale wall at MIT. Could a wall like that come out of a process like Scott's? Recall the improvised stiffener panels added where stresses in the truss were extreme. Recall the colored stress diagrams made by the engineer, which suggested the colored interior frames to the architect. The intriguing question at MIT, or in Trajan's exorcising of Nero, or in Scott's work, is one of the admissibility of contradictory obligations and the possible integration of those contradictions in the partie. Raymond Abraham presented a series of drawings last week. His work, however ethereal and intellectually speculative, always seemed obligated to what I would call a constructibility quotient. To synopsize, here are two bipolar pairs to consider. One, drawing is a manifestation of an introvert system of logic, or drawing as an extrovert's acknowledgement of pressures that can supersede that inner logic. Two, drawings as the validation of an a priori spatial destination, or drawing as a process of perpetual discovery. Conclusion and solution, yes or no. Does the purity of Scott Cohen's effort demand one alternative and deny the other? Scott Cohen.
All right. We'll see. I think you'll see those contradictions here. It's not really a lecture about drawings, but if you'd like to call them that, that's all right. In fact, what I would say I would be talking about is the possible discovery of a relationship between architecture and complex geometry in which they agitate and alter one another. But before I go into this, I will digress and say that it is, in fact, more important to talk about the consequences for this kind of problem about geometry and architecture on the functional aspects of architecture. Because the criteria and categories by which coherence, geometrical coherence, is established are no longer grounded by the symbolic or social parameters of architecture. Thus, the relationship between architecture and geometry that I seek, in that relationship, functionalism is, in a way, at the nexus of the problem. This is because for the architect, the question of geometry, the promise of order, and the evidence of any struggle undertaken toward it is insufficient. Functionality looms large when there's no need for geometry anymore. I won't speak about why we don't need it anymore. I need it nonetheless. But please bear with me for a few moments as I turn to an old project from the last century, 1999, in order to demonstrate my interest in this regard. So can we have the first? There we go. For reasons that I'll elaborate later, can you hear me? This is an odd microphone situation. It becomes evident that the relationship between complex geometry and architecture does not lead to functionality as we know it from modern architecture, but rather to the idea of what I will call a perverse functionality, the condition in which something performs its function, presumably, even better than it would had it been able to perform that task normally, rationally, conventionally, efficiently, whatever way you want to put it, all of those things that architecture isn't. This idea, perverse functionality, comes from the natural philosophers of the 17th century, in fact, who were fascinated with natural wonders. I'm sure all of you have heard about these things. Exceptional forms derived through processes of adaptation in nature under very difficult circumstances. So, for example, a flexible ligament that is shared by conjoined twins, which is an even better ligament than one we would have, not conjoined. These excessively functional things were regarded as marvels. And so too were artistic works that overcame the odds, as it were. I think we share today some of the sentiments of these philosophers. Anyway, in this particular project, I will try to persuade you very briefly that the particular demand of this form to which this building alludes, the torus, that is, it is the form to which it alludes, that this form produces in its demands to organize the space in a particular way an even more, let's say, a sequence better than what one would end up with without the torus. Better, that is, for the particular inhabitant, an artist in this case, who regularly entertains on his roof and paints on his roof at his present house and would like to continue doing it in a different way in the new one. So rather than producing the common scenario, and this entertainment component is central to his whole experience in this house, rather than reproducing the common scenario of passing through an interior on the way to a party in a backyard, for example, as we all do in the summer, when we, for example, encounter the interior as a threshold, as the interval in a threshold between the front yard and the back, and we are as if uninvited guests on these interiors that are empty while activity is populating the backyard. Rather than this sequence from front to back, it was worked out here as a sequence from the roof, from the ground to the roof, and the entire house is once again the interval and a threshold, but in this case, one which is bypassed entirely and entered again through other means in the back. And so what we have here is this very exciting situation where two spaces, we have a kind of dual singularity, this single form which divides, bifurcates space in a manner which I'll be speaking about repeatedly and also in other projects. I studied in this particular instance a project much closer to the phenomenon, at least in time, this 17th century Baroque sacristy built, materialized, co-opted by me because it demonstrated perversely functional forms of adaptation. Though in this particular instance it would not have been of any interest to the natural philosophers because it didn't elicit curiosity. A kind of inexplicit perversion exists here, one that went unnoticed as far as I can tell. Here the problem involves an embrasure, that is that extruded condition around an opening in a wall, that is forced to exist at an interior corner in the sacristy that would cause it to pierce through an exterior pilaster had the embrasure not rotated, as I show it here, rotated, to produce an anomalous form, a tubular void piercing the corner of the building. It's the only pierced building I know. The hypothesis, except in contemporary architecture, the hypothesis instigated a geometrical operation, my hypothesis here, that produces patterns and congruencies among the classical elements that effectively conceal the anomalous episode as a normal one, producing a rarity in the classical architectural canon that arguably evolves the canon to a higher level. So here, what makes it, as it were, perversely functional is the nature of the light brought in through it. The purpose of these odd embrasures that are deep in these sacristies is to create the illusion of a mystical light, a light that, issues from a source not understandable. And in this case, with the rotated embrasure, the light, rather than doing what it would in the upper left, by being what it is on the upper right, light is brought in even more diffusely and even less understandably. But this is brought about because the classical canon is being adapted to this condition of this rotation forced by the pilaster. A taboo within classicism produces an anomalous functional condition which in the end performs better functionally, as it were, than the usual embrasure directly extruded would, where one would more likely perceive the source of light in the upper left. Though still with some difficulty. Anyway, what happens here is a whole set of unfoldings and geometrical analyses to try to discern how it is that the symmetries, congruency among these ellipses is achieved in an interlocking of elements whereby a kind of synthesis of a very high level of Albertian continuitas, a kind of harmony and relationship from part to whole. I wouldn't call it harmony, a kind of tension is established in the modern sense of the word. And that is brought about through these tools of projection. Carrying on, this is a house called the Wu House with Cameron Wu, where the peculiar requirement of the client to have spaces in which he can be heard but not seen creates listening tubes, not unlike those visual cones in the sacristy. Well, the visual tube in the sacristy, lets air pass from exterior to exterior through the corner of the building. Here, from interior to interior are these passages. And here, something very strange happens. We end up putting together these cones of vision with vaults in such a way that a kind of linear coherence is brought about. These lineaments we call lariats are generated. If you know what a lariat is, a kind of loop ties back to itself. So if you follow that line, I don't have a pointer here, you will be able to see that this is a line that intersects itself. It's not a figure eight. It's a fractured figure eight, but it's brought about according to laws internal to the mode by which vaults and cones can be intersected, but here to produce the illusion of a kind of topographical situation, which is at odds with those primitive geometries. The methods by which this is done, it's a very elaborate procedure to gain a very small anomalous result. So there's a modest goal with inefficient means to achieve it. The structural mechanisms of the production of this system have not been as resolved as they should be, Eric, but we'll get back to that. We can see that in other locations, it isn't so apparent that we're dealing with vaults and cones any longer. It would appear that we're no longer, as it were, in Kansas or somewhere else when some other geometry appears to prevail. But this is an illusion. When one gets back to the source forms, they are in fact primitives, cones, ellipses, and cylinders. That is what makes up the entirety of this project. We're very interested in this idea of primitive geometry as the basis for the production of a geometry that appears to arise from different sources. And I brought this tonight in particular because it's this project which I normally don't show. I consider it pretty much a major failure. But this is a proposal made very briefly following the prior project for the Queen's Museum competition And here, the coherent system that unifies, in this case as well, a sphere with the cone and these other geometric elements, connects the two primary surviving fragments of the World's Fair, the panorama of New York, which is located inside the museum, a remarkable model of the city of New York, and this Unisphere Globe, which has basically been disassembled, which stands before the building. Here I model idealizing that relationship. Perambulation in the park and circumnavigation of the model within the building, that is, are synthesized in a new space above which is captured a piece of the site. You can see that on the lower right. That piece of the site that's caught in this new figure, integrating three scales, that of the model within, the small scale museum, the full scale, sorry, the real model, the model itself, the museum itself, and the smallest scale element, the globe in the park. There's an interior view showing those rising. I wouldn't do that because it's the only one that's low, but never mind. Okay. A view of the globe projected, as it were, from this conic figure that would now dominate the facade in an all too classical way. The Ibeam Competition for the Museum of Art and Technology in New York presented a very peculiar condition, which was of interest. The singular duality that was so important in the house, the Taurus-like house, is needed again, that sense of unity and duality. But here, because there are two programs inextricably bound, the museum and an educational program, at a scale, though, in this case, that precludes the development of a single surface or a single lineament like the lariat. Here, a proliferative proposition needed to be made, a proliferative strategy, and I hadn't dealt with proliferation in quite some time, aggregation, the accumulation of motifs, having become so kind of obsessed with these singular figures. And we wanted to propose a structural system, which, by the way, Guy Nordenson worked with us on briefly. And it had something to do with tensegrity, tension and compression members brought together in a mutable system that in this case would, in a way, inhabit the building and define the primary axes of the cones and the cylinders by which we would construct the lariats, which would be in a chain rather than as a singular figure defining the whole. And what happens here is something like the Guggenheim Museum, though doubled. If you all know the Guggenheim Museum in Manhattan, you ascend an elevator and descend entire museum that you missed on the way up by a ramp. In this case, one ascends a series of escalators that bypass every other floor and move on a ramp at the top and descend every other floor that one missed on the way down. The difference here, though, is that this is a localized phenomenon, that circulation system, which allows most of the building to be unimpeded by it. Most of the floors remain flat. You can see on the right diagram. And there is a kind of flexible way in which the escalators can change directions and different connections can be made in order to integrate the programs, and all sorts of different toggled relationship, different dualities can emerge according to different connections. This is the model of the tensegrity system that runs throughout the building, which is changeable. We wanted to offer a paradigm by which to engage the institution, a process, as it were, by which to construct a coherent proposition, rather than to offer a fixed model. As one produces plans through the tensegrity, it produces a very different effect on any given level, depending on where one cuts the building. It's kind of like scanning in a way. A plan is just an arbitrary cut. But as one scans and cuts at different planes, cutting through the tensegrity will create instances of partitioning that vary depending on where one cuts and the particular, genealogy of that tensegrity system will give different angles, give rise to different angles and relationships, all of which become mutable relative to the lariats and combs and cylinders. Some of the views, this is a very collaborative and interesting project undertaken with someone who's been working with me for a number of years, Chris Hoxie, as well as Cameron Wu. And we became, in a way, I believe, perhaps too consumed by these geometrical problems. And I think going back to Eric's point about the external references that we needed to make, I think left the project all too anemic for anyone to really engage it as a reality, though we tried. This was a tepid effort there to make evident a possible reality. If at any point, by the way, you can't hear me, just tell me. I can't tell whether I can be heard.
Adjust the microphone.
Have I been heard?
Yes.
Okay. All right. How's that? Better or worse? Somehow I feel like it's worse, but all right. Here is a view looking through the largest of these, there are many of these, several, I should say, of these conic and cylindrical forms that move through the building that capture voids that pass through and alternating floors. They are then pierced by the tensegrity system and by the circulatory escalators and stairs. You see the occasions where partitions could be introduced plumb adjacent to the chords. So in each instance where this extreme oblique introduces itself, a vertical plane could appear to resolve the problem depending on the exhibition. This is an animation which was undertaken with Chris Hoxie and KD Lab, trying to represent, and you'll see as it concludes, this notion of scanning. But here we're panning, as it were, what would be the multiple scenes for different exhibitions. It's a slow-moving tour, but what we really wanted to have one grasp, even if only cursorily here, is the sense of homogeneity, the sense that the museum is continuous and consistent in its character, though with extraordinary episodes that seem to rupture that experience nonetheless, made out of the same forms, out of the very systems that establish the norm and the field. We're at the top now where the ramp allows the two sequences to be joined. And I believe we're now about to run through a scan of the plans that are made depending, this would be a scan of this particular model, but this is basically the premise that one can move vertically through the system and derive a variety of solutions. Recently, very recently, well, this brings me, I should say, then to some new work that is perhaps too incomplete to show to you, but which nevertheless I will. I have become interested in these, an investigation of architectural interventions, as it were, into non-orientable geometries. The minimal surface is what we could call it, a surface with zero mean curvature. This is Costas from 1982. who derived smoothly curved tunnels leading to infinite planes, unbounded, embedded, non-periodic, obtained by punching 3 holes in a torus and pulling it inside out. Prior to Costa, simple plane helicoids and catenoids were the only unbound, embedded, non-periodic surfaces. A new family of minimal surfaces emerges between 1983 and 1985, incredibly recently. Anyway, these are quite extraordinary occasions for an architect, although they refuse to cooperate with us. What we tried to do, in a really rather naive and crude way, I should add, we were looking for similar degrees of surface curvature between independent geometric forms which could not really ever be brought together. And here is the kind of fudging of an architect. We began with, in this case, the cross cap, one of these in this family, and we simply made an incision, one which would make evident the inside-out continuity of its surface. The incision, of course, disturbs the very most beautiful thing about the form, but it reveals and lets us understand it, reveals it nonetheless. In fact, this is what characterizes so much of what means so much to me as an architect. The violation which reveals the condition to which we don't have access. An experiment for a folly in a garden in Long Island. What happens here, this shows another one. This is the cross cap, a self-intersecting surface. I'm sorry, not the cross cap. The triple point twist, which we froze and grafted, as it were, to the cross cap, which you see in the center there. But where we began to really run into, and these surfaces, by the way, are bound together according to these similar degrees of curvature, which they ultimately don't share. They're ultimately incompatible, but we bring them to a very close point of conjunction. And then when we introduce depth to the surface, we run into yet another crisis, the crisis that all architects run into, deal with primitives or any pure geometric elements. The thickness disrupts, of course, the condition. And here it fractures the surface. You see that we maintain continuity at the center at the expense of discontinuity on one side. You can see here the crisis unresolved. Another version of bringing these incompatible forms together. Finally, we went back and realized that we could as well join these. In this case, the triple point twist is joined with the old lariat that generated the cone in the other project. But here, the lariat, which is this self-terminating line, moves into a surface in which it dissolves in a very different way. It's quite remarkable that the apex of the cone is opposed by its absolute opposite, a dissolution of a line into a surface. We cut the apex off. I can barely bear to witness the apex of a cone anywhere, much less in architecture. Here, it's set into an environment whereby the cone produces a kind of self-intersecting episode. And finally, in the development of this house that I'm presently dealing with, it generates this sort of condition. I think what interests me here is not only, well, there is the perennial disagreement between geometry and materiality, but here it's been doubled. We have the disagreement between one geometry and another. But again, we have this inside-outside condition whereby the surface seems to divide the two conditions absolutely. One of the questions would be what happens today when we deal with this relative to many of the preoccupations we are presently experiencing or enjoying together, or not so much enjoying together, regarding the purpose of these forms or their symbolic import, as it were? I would like to argue that if one chooses to recognize the autonomy of geometry and understand the consequences of disrupting it according to circumstance and architectural conventions, rather than assuming that it somehow means something, we will actually derive unpredictable and unforeseeable outcomes. How does the architect intervene in the world of inviolable geometric form? Can the arbitrary conventional lines and spatial divisions of practical Euclidean forms have anything to do with the necessary lines and spatial indivisibility of non-orientable geometric figures and linear intersections? Not sure, but we have here a plan of the project showing different permutations that are being developed. The systems are quite flexible, though internally utterly resilient. Flexible at the largest scale of manipulation, I would say. In other words, you could, as it were, non-uniformly scale everything at any point, though that's not exactly what we've done here. That is the effect. Architectural constraints such as the definition of thermal boundary between inside and outside, the plumb and the normal surfaces required by program and gravity, are incommensurate with or thwarted by these non-orientables. Again, this is a relationship characterized by insolubility, giving identity to independent bodies of knowledge, or giving evidence of their independence. It freezes the norms of both geometry and architecture, puts the dialectician at a standstill. It's an impasse. If geometric method derives from step-by-step construction, the subsequent building on the previous, one thing after another, in this case, we have something more like contiguity, countermanding functions working against one another, giving evidence of the incompatibility, specificity of different fields of knowledge rather than to compatibility and non-specificity characteristic of so much interdisciplinary activity today. This shows the back where we've engaged directly a road that cuts right across the front. It's a very compressed site. The project evolves into this peculiar synthesis of forms and doubles. This is part of an experiment undertaken for a museum competition. I shouldn't show these to you. I won't tell you what this is for, really. I don't think it's going to turn out to mean anything or be for anything. This one is really not going to be easy to work with. And I will leave this whole part of the discussion to the side now and turn to another part of my work that is going on presently. Before I do that, let me just comment that, and I think this will turn to some of Eric's questions. Throughout the experiments that originated in that first house, lines defined by surfaces that require the continuity of those surfaces, a definite separation between inside and outside, and one side and the other of those surfaces. I've been interested, as I have said already, in the functional consequences of those conditions. And those consequences emerged in this kind of consideration, in this contemplation of these forms. But they are not ultimately, let's say, these functional conditions don't necessarily need these forms. I don't want to argue that. I do believe these forms elicit a different form of functionality, but they do not necessarily demand the forms that bring them about. can the functional consequences, that is, these perverse functionalities, can they persist without the geometry that gave rise to them? Can this confrontation with conventions of occupation and function be brought about by orthogonal architecture? I turn now to what superficially, I hope only superficially, appears to be an entirely different line of work. This is a house I've been working on for the past year and a half, near the Torus House, actually, oddly brought about by that house. In this case, like the Ibeam Competition, there is a structure, though it is not tensegrity. It is a very antique structure. And this structure, too, will inhabit a space. The projects were done concurrently, and I find there are parallels in that regard. The project is to make a house out of a very large barn frame, a frame of a Dutch barn that was disassembled, restored, and brought from 200 miles away to this site, and is on the ground like a kit of parts waiting to be re-erected. We had to get it off the ground because it took too long for us to make up our minds about what we were going to put it in. And it was not liking being exposed. But anyway, here the idea was, I began with many paradoxes in mind. But first, that there is this odd condition where there is an exceptional bay in this building. I ran immediately to the anomaly. I spotted it very quickly and knew that we had on our hands a possible project. It's this added bay on the far upper left of the leftmost diagram. It, being an anomalous one, allowed the introduction of this space, a space which will, here is like a horizontalized, an orthogonal torus-like space. You see in the upper right diagram, passes through and giving unit to the entire external envelope, allowing this structure to seem to be a kind of inhabitant, as I said. What happens is that we have to domesticate what had once been a breeze blowing through the long axis. We have to make it blow in the opposite direction and contain it thermally. The barns are open and their structures are unstable. Making rigid this proposal has led to most of the development of the project. Oddly, we had to introduce a second structure, an entire steel framework in which the entire timber frame is placed. And in doing that, the whole envelope of the building is disengaged from the barn. The barn becomes utterly a surrealist installation piece, unintegrated entirely with the experience. Going against, by the way, the nostalgia that from which this whole thing sprung, the affection for this barn. Clients were very alarmed when they realized their goals to have an open and spatial condition had undermined the authentic experience they would be having with this so-called authentic engagement with the tectonics of the timber, tectonics being what is so absent in architecture, as we know, and longed for so much by many people today. In the face of just having, a platform or balloon frame house, the desire to see something substantial. We knew in the I-beam we had to present structure as a primary derivational component of the project, that surface is not sufficient. So what we have here is that this void is made through the building, and these windows come about. They come about for various purposes, for air movement and light and view, and these are all different things, as it turns out. Standardized size, fixed by manufacturers, all these determinants that we deal with. They dodge and transgress the boundaries imposed by the structure as if to compress a higher number of determinants into just a few variables. The path that you saw as it moved around the building describes the rotation and the peripheric tension and surface continuity that finally leads to this vortexical space at the heart of this breezeway, which is ultimately the outside turned in condition that I'm so interested in, rendering all of what's on the left side of this image seemingly outside, exterior-like, like so many timbers, trees, or anything in the view beyond. The interior is not at all to do with this one unencumbered, exteriorized experience here. I was trying here, as in the Torus House, to create a single space, but one which is not commensurate with the tripartite construct that was given. And instead, there is a kind of spiraling pattern. If I were to do a reading of this plan, I think I could persuade you that it is a kind of rotational order that predominates rather than the tripartite or grid formulation that pre-exists. And there are episodes, as it were, of the perverse functionality that was the basis of these explorations. In many regards, we have learned that thermally this functions better. We're not heating this space, so this whole bay remains unheated, but still visible. There was a whole question of how this space, 40 feet, would be heated, and how it is that it could remain visibly accessible and reasonable on other levels, such as the energy level. And there are all of these odd questions about doors that open in ways whereby they disappear, and in doing so required certain displacements to avoid clearance, to gain clearance with the structure. As of last week, we're halfway to finishing this structure, building something which is apparently somewhat dangerous to build for the fellows who don't know how to do it. The client and her little house. She's obsessed with things being very large. Nothing in this house has been large enough. And I think here you'll see a kind of comparison. Here the view looking out. One of the things that happen when these windows go their own way, as it were, regardless of the pattern required by the subdivisions set up by the barn, windows pass by that, and you see the layering of steel and wood. The windows are allowed to tilt into gaps between the exterior envelope and the steel, and the timber, just in such a way that they are accommodating the manufacturer's demand. So there are these ways in which conditions are fit according to the paradox of the requirement that was initiated at the beginning when the incommensurate strategy of having open space in a barn that needs stabilizing partitions brought about. So it's kind of insurmountable, this is kind of a originary crisis about how to deal with it structurally serves other purposes. None of these things are unfamiliar to anyone, I don't believe, who's dealing with architecture regularly, but it seemed that here it was engaged directly in the derivational problems that I was engaged in. That's that angle almost. Finally, no lecture can conclude today in recent time without addressing this odd problem that everyone has looked at least for a moment. This is from the World Trade Center exhibition at Max Protech Gallery, a project I was dealing with at the same time again, and that required my attention to be drawn to orthogonality again, I thought, at least. The reintroduction of skyscrapers, as you can imagine, for anyone just contemplating this site, and it's a kind of therapeutic process to contemplate it, because that's all we can do as individuals right now. Since this is certainly a project not meant to be realized by any single vision, according to any single vision, it would seem. It's going to have to come about through a very elaborate collective project. Anyway, the reintroduction of a skyscraper seems to pose, the most conspicuous problem. How can they coexist with this memorial and still offer some leasable space, a volume of it which is needed? Very basic question. How to do away with mass and get enough of it at the same time. And a very simple solution here, but it led to an interesting contemplation about architecture, which I think has served me well, ultimately. The solution here was just, a radical reduction in the tower floor plate area relative to tower height. The new towers that I'm presenting are exceedingly thin relative to their height, not unlike one tower that they are similar to, which is the Trump Tower near the UN, not the Trump Tower in Midtown that most of you might know, but another one which is quite remarkable in its height and slenderness. Anyway, these are around 800 feet high. Nowhere near the 1350 of the originals. But anyway, here the height is assessed, I will imagine, not only by actual and apparent dimensions, but by also relative proportions, transparency and reflectivity. And though recognizable as a series, differences in height and color in combination with the apparently unsystematic arrangement implies a certain kind of disunity. Moreover, as a series, they do not demarcate a definitive site boundary. The towers seem to be determined by local circumstances rather than by an overriding pattern, though they actually are unified as a pattern. The towers are similar to some others, and I will talk about that more than just the case of the Trump. Buildings that are constrained by site dimensions. They, in being constrained this way, recall the earlier condition of the pre-war towers, and we're cutting here a plan at 525 feet, and you can see that the sort of maroon-colored towers represent pre-war towers, and that the blue towers are all of the post-war towers remaining. The dark rectangles are the ones I'm showing. So the dark rectangle, they in a way continue a pattern related to the earlier pre-war narrower buildings, but do so in with the form of a sheer parallelepiped, more similar to the post-war bulkier towers that presently crowd out the old thinner ones. So in contrast to their pre-war counterparts, the orthogonal rectilinear form of the new thin towers equates the buildings with the negative spaces between them. And this is, I think, an interesting idea here and only here, probably, because the space will have to remain empty. Unlike any place in Manhattan where at any point those gaps could be filled, the memorial will preserve this peculiar constraint. And in this sense, it is as if the project is an investigation of the architectural consequences of obstacles to the complete redevelopment of an urban site. This brings me to an interesting subject which I've been dealing with recently, the idea of the holdout in architecture. Holdouts are buildings or parcels of land owned or leased by parties unwilling to relinquish them to a developer who has amassed a significantly greater sum total of adjacent or surrounding parcels. Clearly, there is a bias suggested by the term. The holdout is first and foremost subordinate to a dominant entity. A holdout is typically disproportionately diminutive relative to an otherwise uncontested assemblage of properties that would be available for a totalizing, consistent, or coherent redevelopment if it were not for the holdout. Now, this fascination, which is not one that has been only recent for me, but has run alongside all of this autonomy and well, as you would call it, interiority or something like that. This project represents a stark alternative to the dialectic of norm and exception, convention and invention that traditionally has been initiated as a game in architecture, willfully concocted by the architect. Here, the presumption is that the architect as catalyst will be supplanted by the holdout. That is the argument I'm making in this project, that the architect will construct something as though supplanted by something that they could not control at all. Now, the holdout itself as a condition in cities, in and of itself, is not always very interesting, and I want to make a distinction here. Although I like the one I'm showing you right now, this one I like less, but also find interesting. You see the holdout in the center there that made this site end up divided into these very slender parcels on 57th Street. It does not, the holdout, always serve to stimulate a dialect of architecture, which, as I intend in the case that I'm presenting, originates in discord and leads to innovation. In fact, it innovates without innovating anything. In other words, it may or may not result in peculiar or distorted building configurations, and those, of course, are what I'm after. In the undistorted cases of holdouts, both the building occupying the larger area and the holdout remain consistent with whatever building types or conventions that are assumed to be unfettered in situations that are similar but without holdouts. In other words, I'm sure you could go all over LA and New York and find many holdouts that have produced nothing of any interest other than, well, let's say some story about conflicting parties, but no evidently unusual outcomes. Thus, holdouts, I will say, are not synonymous with what I would like to call here holdout architecture. And in the proposal, it is my hope that what we have is a coincidence, as it were, between the architect presumably devising a set of conditions independent of any forces that act on them, and the very real and, let's say, poignant condition that is indicative of this city, very specifically. I'd like to remark that, by the way, that in the case of Trump's tower, a great innovative thing, as it were, what's innovative about it is the way he coalesced air rights, collected them, and built them upon a single site. Well, now laws have been made whereby nothing like that could ever happen again. And I would argue in the case of the sacristy, the analysis that I did of that odd building in Rome, it is not something that has happened again, and that is precisely what preserves the remarkableness of it. It's a singular work. It is not co-opted as part of a canon. This raises an interesting question about how it is that architecture, in its allusion to innovations that are outside of architecture, cancel those very innovations out. That might be a dark way to end a discussion of this particular question, but I think it addresses Eric, even if only obliquely, and I'd like to take any questions you might have, and thank you for coming. Yes.
I'm really fascinated by this idea of the perverse functionality.
Uh-huh.
I kind of wonder, you have to have a seismic switch to get that strange weakness. Is it the same for your project? It seems like there's always some strange condition. And do you think that the singularity of these projects mean that these innovations that you make can't be adopted in a more normative situation? Or what do you think?
It troubles me. I think it's a great question. It troubles me that I would become, I would be in a waiting game for the opportunities that require an anomalous functional arrangement. I think what the Sacristy project demonstrates, which interests me greatly, is that it is not only a demand of functionality that is operative. In that particular case, the requirement that there be a particular kind of light did not bring it about. The problem was brought about when the form that the architect chose to bring it about with was precluded, was disallowed. In this case, by the context, although that's not really clear. It's not clear that that pilaster in the corner of that building pre-existed the intervention. In fact, I believe they existed together simultaneously, and that the architect staged the taboo so that, he would have to deal with it. In other words, he fabricated a problem. There was no problem. I don't think there are very many problems in architecture of that kind, functionally. And so what we have to have are formal problems, which in contest with particular functional ones, elicit a different understanding of function from us. Help us to perceive or to project other possible arrangements. You can't just work with the program at hand. They're more often than not like so many others, like so many other houses, like so many other hotels, they normally are not really something so extraordinary. It's true that in the case of Ibeam, there's an unusual bifurcation in the program which we exploited, but probably that's opportunistic. I was able to make the case for the project by doing that, but I would have done it nonetheless. Yes. I'm very interested. It's in the possibility that buildings change literally over time. It's curious, though, that coherency as a preoccupation is incompatible with this interest, which I simultaneously harbor. In fact, recently I've proposed an investigation of this very problem of aggregation as a process that in itself has a kind of coherency about it. But I really hope that, and it's hard to say this with any surety, but I would like to imagine that living conditions, living arrangements remain free and flexible. In that house, the Taurus, the first one, the artist Eric Wolf has an obsession with, it's another unique condition, moving and changing and constantly rearranging and bringing furniture in and leaving it. And he's quite convinced that this kind of condition is very susceptible to an always changing sequence of things. In fact, we designed it so that only the studio could be built and be heated, and the other part of the house is a winterized, like a winter garden, and there are all of these conditions of temporality and changeability, which we've hope to have anticipated in it. I don't know if that answers you at all. I mean, in other words, on the one hand, there's the changeability of the geometrical discourse, of a geometrical study, which is developed in the laboratory of design. And on the other hand, there's the house, there's the building which is shaped by it, which one anticipates other sorts of conditions of change to occur in that have little to do with that change. I mean, I talked about the Ibeam, another one, which has to do with the fantasy of an architect, that they could offer a means and a mode of designing to someone who knows little about design and work with them directly with it as a kind of malleable and flexible system. There are different temporalities in architecture. I can't say that they are one in the same, commensurate, or related in a very direct and instrumental way. I don't want to argue that. I think they ultimately aren't, and we have to be conscious of life change conditions in a way differently than we are of form generating processes. All right. Yes, Roger. Yes. I brought the holdouts for you, Roger. I brought queens for Eric, and I brought holdouts for you. Okay.
Whether or not you can explain a little bit more in detail how you understand the relationship between contingency and composition, in the sense that when you really want to use the emergent form, there is a question of kind of honesty, with regard to the extent to which you allow those conditions to play themselves out transparently as opposed to using your skills as a trained architect, particularly in the realm of an advanced knowledge of geometry, to somehow reconcile what your own eye understands as a proper set of geometrical relationships, the logic that you're working with, parametrics, as opposed to those of the given, what you parse through the program and discovered in terms of certain trajectories of light or water or what have you.
Oh, it's tough. The only answer I can give you is, that I'm desirous of certain forms and conditions. I ultimately, but I am as desirous of bringing them about with cause, as opposed to bringing them out with the free will of an artist with a vision. I'd like to imagine that these are mediated desires that might have something to do with a broader spectrum of conditions and issues, and geometry represents that for me. It's a discipline. It's a very wide body of knowledge. It's not, and it's shared by many. It may not be something recognizable cursorily to an inhabiting subject, but it underlies and is fundamental to the discipline. So that's that. Wait, what was the other thing there was a very key element there that I think I missed at the end. Well, I have to sorry. So for example, I'm very pained by this problem in this barn house that the causes, the fixed sizes of certain windows according to a budget, the size that I'm allowed to make it, how wide we have 108-inch wide single panes of glass that are tilt-turn windows, and they're over the limit that's allowable, and I had to negotiate. You all do that. Everybody does this. The guarantee for this glass. But how far would we stretch it? But it had to be that size according to God knows how many parameters. But I'm pained by I'm both reassured by the fact that so many causes made me do what I did, and very disillusioned that I wasn't able to uphold the principles of geometry as the primary agent that defined them. And I have my student friends who think I betrayed my discipline. And I think I have too. But it's peculiarly fulfilling to have betrayed it and also disillusioned. It's both. Not to be able to do what you think you have to do and knowing you didn't do it for a good reason. How's that? But getting something, by the way, here's the really ugly part of it, or the most disturbing thing is that you get something that is thrilling, viscerally, visually, performatively, even as you're betraying yourself. I actually am seduced by the outcome and know that I've, sort of been done by whatever, by all these external things. Yeah. In the end. Of course, I know these things are arbitrary too, but that's all right. Thanks.